Okay, today's lecture is about a second industrial revolution that the United States will experience in the second half of the 19th century. One of the really key driving forces behind this is the building of railroads. We talked about this in Unit 3, but at that point the railroads were mainly focused in the northeastern part of the United States, really where we saw the largest industrial buildup that really impacted the outcome of the Civil War. Okay. During the Civil War and in the years after, there's going to be a push to extend those railroads all across the country, all the way out to cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles out in the West. The problem with that was that it was incredibly expensive, and basically no private companies had the ability to pay for this themselves. So the government ends up having to provide subsidies, which basically just means that the government is helping to finance these railroads. The government also will give land grants along the proposed routes, which is pretty much saying that the government was giving those lands for free for these companies to be able to build these railroads. So through this map, you guys can kind of get an idea of where these railroads are being built and where the land grants are being given. At the point that the Civil War begins, there was already a discussion about building a transcontinental railroad in the Congress. Without too much getting into the details, it's safe to say that a lot of the people that were opposed to those railroads leave Congress when the South secedes from the Union. And so that allows the Congress to really be quite productive in building this transcontinental railroad during the Civil War. It's kind of an important thing to note that the Civil War Congress was one of the most productive in the nation's history because it was basically run by one party. The Southern Democrats left. That left the Northern Republicans in charge of Congress. Essentially, there's going to be two railroad companies that are going to work on building this transcontinental railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad, note that name Union, it gives you an idea of the historical context this is happening in. Congress creates this railroad. Basically, the Union Pacific Railroad will start from Omaha, Nebraska, and then they will steadily build west, okay? They will do this using federal loans and immigrant labor. That's one of the important things for the Georgia Milestones test that you guys have to note, and that is the fact that this railroad was built by immigrant labor. The Union Pacific side, it's mostly Irish immigrants. After the war, many of them are going to be Union Army veterans. Who will be building this railroad. This was dangerous work for a number of reasons. They faced attacks from the Indians really in this area, but these guys are working out in the middle of nowhere with very little access to permanent shelter, medical care, things like that. The Central Pacific Railroad will form in the west. They will start in Sacramento, California. And this is going to be started by four men who are going to serve as private financial backers. Okay, so the Union Pacific Railroad is basically entirely government financed. The Central Pacific Railroad is financed by private money. On this side, you've got Chinese laborers who are working. Okay, they are going to complete this railroad in 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah. Basically, the Union Pacific side will work from Omaha and steadily west. The Central Pacific will work from Sacramento, work steadily east, and basically they meet up in the middle. And that point where they meet up is Promontory Point, Utah. All right, so if you guys take a look at this map, you can basically see visually what I just told you about. One of the things I want you guys to think about that made building this railroad particularly difficult are the mountains that particularly the western half of the railroad is going to have to work through. So another element of danger here, blasting your way through mountains to be able to build this railroad is extremely dangerous work. All right, so how is the railroad going to impact American life? Okay, basically, if your town was built along a railroad, your town was going to boom. If your town was unfortunately located far from the railroad, your town was going to die, okay? The railroad's going to create a domestic market for raw materials and manufactured goods. It's also going to create markets for new goods. For example, the railroad would not be possible without the manufacture of steel. All right, guys, let's talk about what's special about steel, okay? Essentially what you do with steel, you take iron, you get it really, really hot, it removes the carbon, and that creates steel. Okay, what's the benefit of like a steel rail on a railroad track versus an iron one? Steel is more flexible, which means it's easier to work with, and it is also rust proof, so it lasts for a longer period of time. Okay, so when Andrew Carnegie is really able to refine this steel process, it makes railroads easier to build and more usable, more long lasting. Okay, the railroads are going to stimulate mining and agriculture because you've got a way to ship those products to, say, workers in cities who need those things. And that's overall going to contribute to the growth of cities, because when workers are in cities, there's now a way that you can get the supplies that they need to them. Okay. Railroad companies are going to help stimulate immigration. That's for a variety of reasons. You need people to build these railroads. Immigrants can move out into the West or into the Great Plains and get involved in agriculture, or they can stay in cities and work in factories producing things that these railroads need. Initially, there's a negative environmental impact. Okay, there's going to be a creation of time zones, and here's why. Okay, if the train comes at 10 o'clock, my definition of 10 o'clock and your definition of 10 o'clock needs to be the same thing. So they needed to standardize time. We're going to create the first millionaire class here. Again, you guys are looking at that graphic organizer with people like Andrew Carnegie who are going to become filthy, ridiculously rich based off of an invention used in the railroad industry. But the downside of all of that money is the corruption that can result, both in private business but also in the government. Okay. Okay, so one of the things the government's going to try to put in place is the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 to try and cut down on some of this corruption. Okay, what the Interstate Commerce Act did was prohibit rebates in pools and required railroads to openly publish their rates. Here's why that was important. Okay, railroads could have different rates for different people, and this is one of the ways that they put their competitors out of business. Okay, so if my friends have a much lower shipping rate, they're making more money than the people I charge double to. Those people go out of business. Okay, they're going to forbid unfair discrimination against shippers and outlaw charging more for a short haul than for a long one. Okay, all of these were different tactics to put companies out of business. The Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, was set up to administer this law and to enforce the legislation. So if you felt that you were being unfairly charged, you would go to the ICC and they would resolve that problem for you. Impact. We've got a fear of corruption here in the ICC. What happens when these millionaires come into those officials in the ICC and pay them off to turn their heads against corruption? It did provide a forum for competing businesses to work to resolve their conflicts. It stabilized an existing business system, and it was the first large-scale act by the federal government to regulate in a business in the best interest of society. Remember, the latter part of the 19th century is very much laissez-faire, which means that the government is hands-off when it comes to business. This is the first sort of example of that changing, as we're going to see with the progressive politicians at the turn of the century. So overall, if we need to summarize the economy in the latter part of the 19th century, we are going to see a period of rapid industrial expansion led by the railroad. This is possible because of an abundant amount of liquid capital. Liquid capital is cash. These millionaires have money that they can invest into businesses, which will make them even more cash. Okay? The United States is able to do this because of our abundance of natural resources. Okay? These railroads and factories will use coal, oil, and iron. Okay? Massive immigration of this period provides a large-scale labor force. Unfortunately, this expansion is very slow to come to the South for a variety of reasons. Okay? We're also going to see examples of American ingenuity. Okay? We're going to see a guy like Alexander Graham Bell, who will invent the telephone, and then Thomas Edison. Okay? So please, right now, if you're taking notes, write down Thomas Edison. He is the second inventor in this course that you have to know, that you will be asked about on the Georgia Milestones test, and I will ask you about it on your vocab quiz in your test. Thomas Edison had a shop in New Jersey, and basically it was just a research lab. He had ideas, and he tried them out over and over and over again until the ideas worked. He will invent the phonograph. Okay, A phonograph, it looks sort of like a record player with a huge horn on the end, okay? And it allowed you to play music. He invented the electric light bulb, okay? It took him something like 200 tries before he finally got it right. Next, he invents motion pictures, which is basically the beginnings of what provide the way for our TVs and movies and other things that we watch today. So the overall impact of this new economy on America, the overall standard of living for Americans rise. For some more than others, okay, but the overall standard goes up. Women are going to start working in larger numbers, particularly poor immigrant women who work in cities. And that is going to really accentuate the class divisions. Okay, so you guys are going to you're going to see people like John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan. These guys literally had more money than they could ever spend in 4 lifetimes, much less one. On the bottom, you had people that were really working hard and still couldn't put food in their mouths. Okay, and these class divisions become extremely obvious during this period. If you guys will remember at the beginning of this course, we learned that something like 90% of Americans were farmers. And I told you that that pendulum was going to gradually swing in the other direction, and it's happening at this point. A nation of farmers becomes a nation of wage earners, meaning that people have jobs and are working to do things, okay, rather than, subsistence farming, making what you need to survive. Because all of these factories are producing mass amounts of items, there's a pressure there for foreign trade. Who are we going to sell all of these items to? Okay, keep this in mind. This is going to be a driving force in American imperialism that we'll talk about in Unit 6. I talked about millions of immigrants coming into America during this period. These immigrants are going to pack into cities, and that creates a large unskilled workforce. Okay, so let's talk about the division between skilled and unskilled labor. Okay, unskilled labor, sweeping a floor, digging a ditch, turning a hand crank on a machine, all right? That is, compared to the person who fixes the machines or builds the machines, okay? In general, unskilled labor is going to be much more poorly paid, okay? And they are the workers that are most likely to be mistreated. So overall, let's summarize what it was like to work in the Gilded Age. Okay, this period, the latter part of the 19th century, is known as the Gilded Age. Okay, what does that mean? Gilding, strictly defined, is when you put a thin layer of gold on the outside of something. Okay, the best example I can give you, the Georgia State Capitol downtown, if you're on 75 South going past Turner Field, or headed towards Turner Field, that big gold dome, that's an example of gilding. Okay, what it means is that there was a very thin layer of prosperity in the hands of a very small number of people that covered up a lot of problems in this era. Okay, problems with workers, problems with immigrants, etc. Okay, so let's talk about what it was like to be an average worker in this period. These were people who did unskilled, repetitive manual labor. It could be your job was to sew a collar on a shirt for 12 hours a day, all day long. Okay, it could be that your job was to crank a machine and put a hole in a piece of metal all day long. Okay, it was extremely boring. Factories were run by unpersonal corporations. That means that your boss does not care about you. He does not care if you are sick. He does not care if you have a sick child. He doesn't care that your father's on his deathbed. Does not care. You need to be at work. Okay? At the maximum, factory workers worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. This was all designed to maximize the profits of the business owners. They were not concerned about the workers themselves. Okay? Piecework encouraged speed, and what that means is if my job is to sew collars on shirts all day long, I am paid according to how many collars I sew on in a day. So the faster I work, the more collars I sew, the more I can get paid. Okay? This work was performed in sweatshops. These were very, very dangerous factories. Okay? So let's talk about those dangers. The machines were extremely noisy. That meant that workers' hearing was impacted. Light and ventilation were poor. You couldn't see what you were doing. The machines put off exhaust, you breathe that exhaust in all day long. Or you worked in a cloth factory, let's say cotton weaving into cloth, and you were breathing those fibers into your lungs all day long, okay? Fatigue. I want you to imagine it's 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. You have spent the last week working 10-hour days. You are exhausted. And when people are exhausted, they are more likely to make mistakes. The equipment broke all the time, and people got hurt because of that. There were also careless training that led to accidents and fires, which we're going to look at later on this week, okay? And child labor was rampant, okay? Why kids? There's a couple of different reasons. Kids worked cheaper. Kids were small, and they could fit up into enclosed places, like fixing the machine. Okay, you just send the kid up to do it. Here's another thing to remember, guys. There are no laws in place to guarantee the safety of workers. There are no minimum wage laws. There are no breaks. Okay, so if you got to pee, you got to hold it all day long. Okay, there are no child labor laws, and there is no assistance of any kind for workers that are hurt or killed on the job. Okay, so there's no disability insurance, there's no unemployment, there's no social security, there's none of that. Okay, so if you got hurt at work, you were pretty much going to be dependent on family members for the rest of your life, or you were going to be out on the street. There's nothing to fix you. Okay, a lot of this stuff we're going to look at over the course of this week, and you're going to read these things again in the jungle. Okay, so just be on the lookout for these same kinds of things being described. Thanks for listening.